Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to the Islamic Vice podcast. I'm your host Majid, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Brother Rash, and special co-host, Brother Abdul Ahad, all the way from Montreal, Canada. Assalamu alaikum, brothers, and welcome to the show.
Wa
Walaikum
alaikum
salam
salam.
wa rahmatullah.
How are you guys doing?
Alhamdulillah, very good, very good. I'm local to you, so I'd rather hear from what's going on in all the way over in Montreal.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah. Alhamdulillah, well, I'm doing well. There was the issue of sort of forest fires as well as tornado warnings,
Okay.
but alhamdulillah, we're good. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean,
Yeah.
the last time we recorded a podcast together, it was snowing in Canada. Because I
Yeah.
remember when you WhatsApped me and you was like running down some street in heavy snow. What's the weather look like now? Is it nice?
The weather right now, it's all right. The air quality is getting better, but it is a bit smoky.
Smoky.
Okay.
Yeah. A little bit of a smog, I guess, in the air, but it's not as bad as before.
Seen. I guess that's from the forest fires.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because normally Canada's, whenever you think of Canada, is you picture this outdoors, clean environment type of place. So that's why I thought I'd clear that up because I didn't expect it to be like Delhi. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, usually it is, but just because of these forest fires, there was a few weeks, not a few weeks ago, a week ago or something. We had the worst air quality in the world, even worse than like Dubai or like Lahore or New Delhi. Yeah,
Okay.
but yeah,
Well, Alhamdulillah, as long as you're well
alhamdulillah.
and people are safe from the fires, I guess it's just something that happens, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Alhamdulillah. It's just another test of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, sure, man. Sure. Cool, guys. Inshallah, let's get into the topic of today's podcast. And the topic is a serious one. As we know, last week was the 20th year anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide, massacres, whatever you want to call it, and which occurred in July 1995, a long time ago. And actually, if you're watching the footage that they've been shown on TV, they're still finding remains of those who were killed up until today. And they buried, I think, 30 this year. They have like a ceremony in the area where they bury the newly found remains. And for those who probably don't know, Srebrenica is a place in Bosnia. And what we see is there was the Bosnian War between 1992 and 1995, which kind of like came about due to the breakup of Yugoslavia. And throughout actually the whole war itself, there were many atrocities that were committed. And Srebrenica actually occurred towards the end in I think the final year of the actual war itself. And without going into too much detail, a brief summary really would be the fact that the war was being fought between the Bosnian Serbs and the Croats and the Muslims, who were known as Bosniaks. And basically what happened was the aggressors were the Serbs. And at one stage during the conflict, the UN basically kind of intervened and they set up safe zones within Bosnia. And Srebrenica was one of these safe zones where basically the people were supposedly safe from any aggression. And throughout these safe zones in Bosnia, the majority of the people within the safe zones were actually Muslims. And Srebrenica was actually one of these UN safe zones. So within these safe zones, the Muslims were kind of disarmed. So, their weapons were taken away. And okay, fair enough. It's meant to be a safe zone and UN is protecting them. So why would they need weapons? What we saw in Srebrenica was the Serbian troops just march into the town, separate the men, boys from the women, and basically what in next couple of days, what we saw were around 8,000 and maybe more executions of the men and the boys, and the women were basically taken away on buses to these sort of safe houses where they were tortured, systematic rape occurred during the Bosnian War, and obviously this is something which is, when you think about the history of the Ummah, these are dark days. And in fact, the entire Bosnia War, if you look at recent history of the Ummah anyway, certainly is seen as something which is like dark days. So, today's topic, I don't think we're going to probably go too much into detail of what happened within the Bosnian War, what caused it, and so on. What I would suggest is that for those who are not familiar with what happened in Bosnia, Srebrenica, and within the conflict, really go and do your reading, because this is history which we need to learn from, and this is recent history. As Muslims, we should know, as being one ummah. What I wanted to concentrate more on throughout our discussion really would be what kind of lessons we can take from what happened. And, with this event occurring 28 years ago, as Muslims, within 28 years, have we learned those lessons? Have we, changed in the way we do things? Or are we still suffering from the same mistakes? Are we falling for the same traps, and so on? So, alhamdulillah, I think this is going to be a fruitful discussion for us all. As always, Rash, I'll come to you first, bro. What are your thoughts on the discussion? And yeah, let's kick in maybe into the lessons, what we can learn, and so on. So yeah, over to you, bro.
Yeah, no, from my point of view, I think because they obviously do mention it every year. So there's, every year, from the 20th, especially there was the 20-year anniversary, 21st year anniversary, etc. So you do get an amount of media coverage, unlike maybe other things. And you can understand why, because clearly it's well known as one of the most recent genocides. So from my point of view, sometimes kind of one of the lessons to start off with is that it's easy just to go, oh, it's just another year, it's mentioned again, and you kind of let it go past without really reflecting and discussing and, finding a little bit more out. And what I found is each year, I don't know if you guys noticed this as well, each year you learn something new about what happened then, because either more information is coming out, or there's people that are, doing, even the 30 that you mentioned, that were found, the bones and stuff that were found this year and identified, is because there are people diligently still looking into what happened, who died. There's this person, goes around collecting the bones and identifying them and stuff, so that, the next anniversary, those people who they found in terms of some remains, the families can, get a degree of closure. Nothing's enough, but it's a degree of closure, isn't it? So that's one of the lessons, I think, is to make sure that each year we do reflect on it. But I think the challenge we have is, and I know we said this many times, and I know, Mad, you've done other content on this topic as well, and you've mentioned that a big part of it is political awareness. I personally don't think there has been sufficient amount of political awareness amongst the masses of Muslims to recognize that, or to prevent this from happening again, because, and we can talk about it later, but because of what's happening in, say, India at the moment, because of what's happening in, say, Israel, well, in Palestine, and by the Israelis at the moment. And there's a lot of linkages. For one, I'll give just one example and then I'll pass back to you guys. But one example is, this year I've been reading more, and I hadn't come across this previously, about the amount of weapons that were provided by Israel to the Serbs as part of the war that they were carrying out and the genocide that they carried out. A few years ago, it came to, there was a freedom of information request on finding out where all the weapons came from, and the Israeli government came out and said, "Oh, we can't disclose this, otherwise there'll be a national security issue." So it's clear that there's more information coming out all the time. We already know the West were complicit, but now we're hearing that there's more details that you hear each year. So it's heartbreaking, man, because especially if you see how blatant it was, and the more information that comes out just makes you really reflect even more. So that's a little bit of my thoughts. I'll give you more as we discuss, but I think political awareness and reflecting on this new information each time is important.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. Brother Abdul Ahad, you mentioned just before we started recording that you've actually done some research within your studies on what happened within Eastern Europe, and you also mentioned nationalism, and I think that was one of the big key factors, because if you look at Yugoslavia, one of the things during the communist Yugoslavian period was that people were kind of maybe united behind the ideology of communism. However, when that collapse happened and we saw nationalism and come about, things kicked off. However, just get your thoughts, bro, just to kick things off.
Yeah, Bismillah. SubhanAllah, there's quite a few things to dissect, nevertheless, but just the first preliminary sort of thoughts that I have. Of course, there is the sort of the flawedness of the sort of Yugoslavian kind of vision to homogenize this region that is filled with diversity. That, of course, if we look at previous regimes, the Ottoman Muslims recognized this diversity and governed based upon this diversity. So we do see this sort of kind of trend of trying to homogenize by communist states, most of the time, the regions, be it in China, for example, be it in Yugoslavia, and how flawed it was not to recognize the sort of sectarian divisions under Tito's sort of reign in Yugoslavia, and of course towards the fall of Yugoslavia. And then the other sort of aspect we're definitely going to touch upon is this sort of theme that we should look at, which is this sort of flawedness of global liberal institutionalization. And there's a lot of dependency on the UN as a so-called global government to heal all these sort of, or heal or prevent all these sort of atrocities. But in reality, there's, of course, we already just touched upon the issue of the demilitarization of the Bosniak-Muslims and the factions pertaining them, and that leading them to be defenseless, causing a huge genocide. So these are just sort of preliminary thoughts that I'm going to build a lot upon, inshallah, for this podcast. So yeah.
Alhamdulillah. I mean, some of the things that you mentioned there, it'd be really good to go into them more deeply. But just thinking what you're saying there in regards to the mix-up of that region. Because like you're saying, when the Ottomans were there and you look at the Ottoman rule, if we look at in Europe, the Ottoman rule in Europe, certainly in the Balkans, you didn't really see mass conversions except in Bosnia. So the Bosnian people, the Croats and the Serbs, they are from Slavic background. So basically they are what called South Slavs. However, what we see is that there was still a recognition on the part of the Serbs or the Croats that these lot were Muslims. And I remember, if I'm going to give, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when this stuff was happening, and I can still remember to this day when it was on TV, it was on the news, and they were showing it, and watching it, and they were saying Bosnian Muslims, right? And to me, I was seeing just white people, if I'm going to put it bluntly. So at that time, it was a case like, because I was pretty young, it was like, yeah, they're not Muslims, they're Muslims, somebody else, because it was like in Europe, they're white. How can they be Muslims? Muslims look like me, they're brown, right? And that's when you read more into it and you look at certainly the situation in Bosnia and certainly under the communist rule. You wouldn't say that the Bosnian Muslims were very practicing, right? Maybe there wasn't even much differentiation between them, the Serbs and the Croats. I mean, ethnically they're the same. So, obviously there would have been some who kept their Muslim identity in their names. There was still like a Muslim identity. However, you wouldn't say that the most practicing people. But I remember when this stuff was going on, and when I started learning a bit more about Islam myself, and when you think about the ayat of the Quran, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the Jews and the Christians will never accept you until you follow their religion. And to me, what happened in Bosnia kind of fits that perfectly, because here you had people who were integrated, right? They were integrated. But when push came to shove, they were dealt with because they were Muslims, because they were seen as the remains of the Ottomans. And to me, that was always quite profound, the fact that, certainly you get, up until now, people, even within the Muslim community, were pushing about becoming more integrated, assimilate into the society. But here, you look at yourself, and certainly you look at in like UK, or look at calendar, just by looking in the mirror, you realize you look different. Here, we're talking about a place where the people were probably, they were kind of the same. The only difference was their beliefs. Some were Catholic, some were Orthodox, some were Muslims. However, they systematically wanted to ethnically cleanse them because they were Muslim. So to me, that's a really big message, a really big lesson to take from this. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, subhanAllah. So in regards to these sort of sectarian divisions, firstly, ethnically, of course, all these people are South Slavs. So physically, there is that sort of look upon this. In regards to the idea, for example, that a lot of them were like secular Bosnians, the issue is that especially in urban centers during Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav sort of regime, you did have quite a few secularized Bosniak Muslims. There's no doubt about that. But there actually was quite a few, especially in the rural areas, Bosniak Muslims who were practicing. They had their own sort of traditions. Yugoslavia actually tolerated them in the preliminary sort of times. Of course, in different communist regimes, if we were to compare the Soviets in Chechnya, for example, or the Soviets in Romania, the way that they treated Muslims was quite different depending on the issue. So sometimes they were more tolerant. In Afghanistan, it was another issue; they were not tolerant at all. But in Romania, they were tolerant to Muslims. So, of course, in Yugoslavia, you had, just as I gave the example of the Soviet Union, in Yugoslavia, you had different variations of tolerance, and they were more tolerant in the preliminary stages in the rural areas, and there was practicing like sort of Islam, I guess, in the more rural areas. But for sure, like as you said, like there's this whole issue of like I would actually say more assimilation, because integration is kind of being part while you have your part, whereas assimilation is like sort of just completely like leaving out your sort of traditional values.
Mhm.
So there is that sort of theme, not just for communist states, but just even secular liberal states. When we come and we sort of lose our particular deen, and perhaps this sort of, I guess, inferior complex does play out. For example, when the UN came and told the Bosnian Muslim army, or factions, that to disarm themselves, perhaps like there was that sort of cognitive issue, cognitive kind of, I guess, like submission sometimes to like, okay, we're going to trust this higher authority in order to surrender our weapons for the sake of so-called peace.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And also just to add as well, if you look at the kind of Islam that you had in Bosnia, like you're saying, there may have been people that were practicing. What we see is that there was prevalently like a Sufi type belief. So it wasn't really affecting anything in society as such as personal beliefs. But what you're saying is right there. The fact that there wasn't really assimilation, certainly after communism collapsed. But also, you mentioned the UN and their role. You said that maybe there was a bit of research that you did on this topic. But what we see is actually you had the UN. There was also like there's like Rush made a really good point that so much more information is being sort of like received since it's happening, and you can see the role that countries like UK, US, France kind of played as well, in regards to some would say allowing this to happen, because they had the means to try to stop this. But in regards to the issue to do with the UN, this is a big issue, because if we look at Srebrenica, what we see is the fact that, like you said, the Muslims, they put their weapons away, and they were in protected zones. However, we see video footage of the Serbs walking in, actually having a drink with those UN officers. And there's testimonies that if you do a bit little research, that things were happening in front of those UN soldiers, which basically there were rapes happening in front of them. The separation of the men and the women was happening in front of them. But the excuse that's given is, well, there was only 300 Dutch soldiers, so what could they do? But then that sort of like opens up the question of, well, how can you call it a protected zone? How can you promise these people remove their weapons whilst the Serbs are being heavily armed by Russia? And now what Rash mentioned, we find out they were obviously being armed by the illegal entity as well. Why would you promise this security when in fact they weren't capable of stopping the Serbs? That's not like a mistake. To me, that's a crime, because you're talking about people being executed in plain view based on these promises, which really they were false.
Yeah.
Just a quick one for me, and it also highlights, you know, how you're saying that each year when they have these anniversaries, there's that element of, oh, we're upset, you know, they try to make out that they're affected by the fact that they didn't do more in that situation. They try to show an element of guilt and regret, but in fact it's so hollow, because a lot of the things that they were doing then and what made them complicit is what's making them complicit in the atrocities that are happening across the globe till today. And I think this is quite key. And I know we should stick to the Srebrenica thing initially, but it's also linked with what's happening in the likes of Ukraine, and how, you know, they want to, their weapons. It's a lot to do with, you know, they recognize that the sale of their weapons is part of their ideology in terms of capitalism. They want to continue to make sure they can maintain that level of, you know, kind of power structure, as well as they've always seen the Muslims as the cannon fodder. So whether that's now in, like I said earlier, India and in Palestine, the same applied then in Bosnia. And this is key, because again, like I said, every year when they come out with these, oh yeah, we could have done this, we could have done that, there were geopolitical issues that, you know, like the 300 you mentioned there, they try to excuse themselves whilst taking a degree of blame. But they're trying to go, oh yeah, you know, that we should have done better, this we should have done better, we, you know, oh, we couldn't get more involved because then that would have escalated the war itself. They try to excuse themselves in a way, but you can only excuse yourself if you then subsequently apply those lessons that you think you've taken yourselves in other factors and in other so-called, you know, foreign policy. Yet actually their subsequent foreign policy, even though it's in a more of a neo-colonial way rather than a direct colonial way, it still fits the same map, the same blueprint. They're still continuing to kind of have that ideological dominance, or what they're trying to do over the Muslims in many other countries, whether it's directly themselves or whether they're funding Israel, or whether they're funding or promoting India, or covering up India's attack on Muslims.
Crimes.
And build up to genocide there as well. You know, that's one of the steps toward genocide, is the dehumanization of Muslims, and 100% the dehumanization of Muslims is happening in India as we speak today.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, bro. Because what was the famous thing? Never again.
Yeah.
Never again, unless it's Muslim.
Never forget. Never forget.
No, not never forget.
Oh.
I think it's like there's a saying like, you know, we would never allow this to happen again, type of thing. Right, unless obviously it's Muslim, because if it's Ukraine, and we know what's happening in regards to Ukraine, it's more than just one side attacking another side. But look at the response.
Exactly.
Look at the response. Yeah. But if it's happening in the Muslim to Muslim people, you have a different response, right? But Abdullah, you know, in regards to the UN, then just to go into this a bit more, is what was their role then, and what were they complicit in?
Yeah.
through when the
So
research that you've done.
yeah. So subhanAllah, like just taking a theme that Rash took in order to answer this question, there is this sort of ideological selectivism that occurs at, you know, any sort of, if the victims are basically more prone to being, I guess, part of that sort of liberal capitalist secular sort of I guess you could sort of say set of entities in the world, mostly in the West, then for sure they're going to come and help their sort of I guess their brothers. Of course, when it comes to the role of the UN, I used a particular international relations term, which was basically liberal institutionalization. So basically, generally speaking, without going too much into depth, the UN was made in order to create peace. This was the so-called intention. Um, to balance power between states. Of course, it never really was this entity to create global governance in order to regulate, okay, what countries should do, except in the case of if you know there are more minor countries, you know, that aren't in the veto powered sort of position, such as the U.S., France, U.K., China, Russia, etc. The role of the UN was to, of course, maintain that sort of status quo peace, that sort of balance of power. But the issue is that it's not a single entity, the UN. It's a heterogeneous entity filled with people and filled with states with different ideologies and different goals and means of goals and different ideas of how to sort of pertain a society, but not only that, how to, for example, dominate other societies. And people will use the UN as a sort of tool or a sort of organizational mechanism in order to seek their Machiavellian gain. So when it comes to this particular issue, I mean, it's very clear that for me, I remember reading about the sort of complicity of the UN instead of the sort of so-called ignorance and the so-called lack of communication. There were definitely elements of the peacekeepers that did have, for example, um, like they were basically anti-Muslim sort of entities. You know, the peacekeeping sort of initiative. Firstly, there's a clause in the UN that when they install peacekeepers, of course, their goal is to make safe zones for civilians, or even safe zones for surrendering rebels, or most of the time rebels, because they don't like to deal more with state entities, but most of the time armed rebels in the Congo, for example. But the thing is that the UN peacekeepers cannot commit to missions. The only time they did commit to missions, I believe, was in it was either in it was in the Congo, where actually they led a particular sort of offensive front, um, different combination of countries in the peacekeepers in order to curb the influx of rebellion of rebel groups being created so that there could be more sustained peace. But of course, in this particular case, in Bosnia, we had that so-called safe zone that was established. And what happened is that they disarmed one side, you know, they didn't disarm, it's not like they disarmed the Serbian side at all. And once you do disarm one side, and the other side will sort of have this advantage. Of course, they're going to take advantage of that. And the Serbian side, who don't have hostile views of the UN, um, did, of course, commit their atrocities. And it was, you know, you just spoke about the numbers, 8,000 Muslim men, and between men and boys, and were executed. And I believe 25,000 to 30,000 Muslim women were violated. So, subhanAllah, this is like an issue about the UN. And as Muslims, one lesson we take is like how we shouldn't rely upon these global institutional kind of mechanisms. You know, I remember there were so many like initiatives, even in Chechnya, for example. Not going too much into depth of the UN trying to get involved, but of course, you know, the UN doesn't want to get involved with Russia. Russia has veto power in the Security Council in the UN. So they're not going to allow peacekeepers to enter. So then what did the Muslims do? You had the likes of Amir Khattab, who actually made something called the Islamic Peacekeeping Brigade. who basically, defended different Muslim villages in Chechnya and Dagestan. And of course, although he wasn't really supported that much by the global Muslim initiative, the thing is that just the thought of it, the idea that, we're going to detach ourselves from this global liberal institutional kind of superior complex, and we're going to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're going to make our own sort of groups in order to defend ourselves. That's very noble and very honorable, regardless of the outcome. So these are just some lessons that I'm just thinking about, and that could have perhaps prevailed a better outcome for the Bosnian war. But nevertheless, we do see this happen, and we definitely we are seeing this in the matter of the Uyghur Muslims as well. This sort of systematic genocide that's occurring at a more longer rate than the Bosnian one. So are we going to once again rely on the UN?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think with the UN, when we're talking about lessons learned, then I think maybe one of the lessons the Ummah in 28 years probably has kind of learned is I don't know what your views are, guys, but when I'm generally speaking to Muslims out there, now I think they see UN for what it is. They you don't, even when it's about Palestine or you're speaking about certain issues that are going on, so people will turn around and say, well, look, look how much, look at Saddam Hussein. He was supposedly, he violated 1 or 2 or 3 UN resolutions. Look at what the illegal occupation is doing in Palestine, right? You look at things like the Golden Heights, and specifically if we're talking about peacekeepers, the UN peacekeepers that were in the Golden Heights, what Muslims have to understand is that they're really there to preserve the status quo. Because if they're not there, then the Muslims can take back their land. But if they're there, then they can't, right? And then what will happen is, after X amount of years, some nation will say, yeah, we recognize the Golden Heights as part of Israel, right?
Yeah.
Just think about, you had these, I know it's kind of separate to the UN, but you had these Camp David Accords and all these Oslo Accords, and the Muslims are like, yeah, now we've got these international players trying to resolve our issues for us. But if you look at whichever conflict it is, and now the perfect example is in Palestine, since the Muslims kind of stopped completely resisting, and they are now partially resisting because they kind of like believed in some sort of like overall authority to give them their justice, their freedom and whatnot. Since then, the situation hasn't gone better, it's gone worse. More land has been taken over the years when these two-state solution nonsense was promoted and all these Camp David Accords and stuff like that. All it does, all these resolutions do, is stop the Muslims. They don't stop the other side. So me personally, and I don't know if you guys share this view, but I think a lot of Muslims that I speak to, one of the good things, alhamdulillah, and I think Srebrenica is maybe the kickstart to this, where they do actually see that, you know what, now we're not going to look to the UN for Palestine to be liberated. We're not going to look to UN for Kashmir and stuff like this. They don't know what the solution is, or they're probably afraid of saying what the solution is. But I think a lot of Muslims globally now, I think UN now is seen as, for what it is, an American tool that's used for pursuing their own foreign policy.
I tend to agree with you in that respect. I think from that point of view, when I said earlier about kind of the political naivety, I think to give the benefit of the doubt on those elements, I think a lot more Muslims are aware that, like you say, they can't rely upon the UN. But I think where there needs to be a little bit more digging by people who want to instigate a degree of change is to really look at what the UN represents. Who founded the UN? The US were the ones who founded the UN. Who provides the most funding to the UN? The US does. Someone will argue, oh, okay, it's based on GDP. So obviously America's GDP is high, so they give a larger amount. But even so, they were founded by them. They are mostly funded by them. And what happens when it's in other conflicts within kind of their own, between European nations, then the UN might come in and do some good. But as soon as it's a conflict between anybody who's opposing their ideology, be it Muslims or be it the Russians or be it China, then all of a sudden the UN suddenly becomes completely useless, as they are anyway, but in those situations. So this is where anybody who does digging, and I think Abdullah, I think you might be able to add something here as well, because you've studied in this area. Anybody who digs a little bit deeper will realize that off the back of World War II, when America, once America became the sole superpower, it recognized that it needed a global system in place whereby, people can't start taking one another's land anymore like they did before, because if they allowed that, you could have other nations taking one another over, becoming strong enough to take on the US. However, the US were clever enough to go, let's create these systems like the UN. Then there was like the Westphalia, there was Bretton Woods, and all of these things that happened that meant that the international order is maintained. And someone might say, well, what's that got to do with Srebrenica? What's that got to do? But it absolutely 100% has to do with all of these, the Uyghur Muslims and, Palestine. And it's all linked, because when you do not allow, especially the Muslims who have an ideology that is powerful, to be able to unite, and when you continue to divide them, and then you have a global structure that maintains global supremacy for the US, for example, then naturally you will continue to have these massacres and these genocides, or even just the suppressing of anybody who wants to oppose them. And when they control the media alongside that, and yes, I know an element of that is changing now with the way the world is connected, but to now at least, they have that power. And I think that's the bit, as Muslims, we need to dig into that a little bit more, and then realize actually the way to solve this is to try to overcome that and not fall for those traps constantly. And that's all linked back to the UN as well. That's where it started, or part of where it started.
Yeah. Like, subhanAllah, one thing you mentioned, that sort of the context, the historical context of the UN was made. It was actually correcting, after the First World War, there was the League of Nations that was made in order to so-called prevent peace, prevent war.
Yeah, to prevent peace, bro. You got it right there.
Yeah, it's so-called. Yes, subhanAllah. Yeah, but of course, with the rise of Nazi Germany and of course World War II, what happened afterwards? The UN was literally just the victors of the Allied factions.
Exactly.
And basically and in terms of what Brother Rash said, in terms of the US, I mean the UN's Navy, for example, like its peace, in terms of its peacekeeping operations, the entire Navy is just the US Navy.
Exactly.
Whenever they have to deal with naval issues, it's dealing with the US. So of course, within the UN, you do have, of course, superpowers such as China, Russia, but nevertheless, you do have that sort of hegemony of this American hegemony in it, and China is trying to rise up within it. So there's a whole particular context of whose war is it, when it comes to that. When it comes to the matters of the Bosnian war, it wasn't really sort of relevant for the UN, other than sending symbolic so-called peacekeepers. Of course, when we look at Ukraine, but now Russia is of course a veto-powered sort of member of the Security Council in the UN that can veto literally anything. So of course, the other states such as the US, the UK, France are concerned about that. They're concerned about Ukraine. Ukraine is a strategic point that I forgot which kind of energy it has. I think it's natural gases. It has one of the biggest, I guess, like nuclear sort of plants or something. I forgot the issue in Ukraine, but of course, Ukraine has particular energy sources that are vital to
silicon as well, isn't it? There's quite a few.
Yeah,
You're right. You are right. There is lots of resources
there's quite
there.
a few. So of course they're going to be worried, of the Ukrainian victims. Of course there are victims, but of course they're going to be more concerned about those sort of particular victims compared to Bosnian war, where that doesn't really necessarily help Western imperative. So we have to realize that, it is not a sort of, like humble kind of humble initiative. It's something that has a lot of context to why they act upon different sort of initiatives. It's not, the UN is not this sort of altruistic entity at all. It's just
Exactly.
composed of these selfish entities that have their sort of ideological positions, and they want to get their sort of they want to assert power. This is my sort of outtake in it, and within my outtake, it's not just a sort of a Muslim outtake. This is a more of a what we call in international relations an offensive realist, neo-realist kind of position that people are just trying to assert one another, regardless of how institutionalized, globally institutionalized we've become. There still are those power-hungry kind of factions, be it people, be it states, be it parties, that wants to assert their power.
Yeah. And
Anyway,
last one. Yeah, you go, Rush. Go for it.
sorry, it was really quick. I would just quickly check because it's neon as well. I don't know if you looked into this. The production of neon creates microchips. So since the war there, the global shortage of microchips can be linked directly back to the war that's happening in Ukraine. Yeah, and it's a massive factor because then if you, as Abdullah had said about the rise of China as well, globally, a lot of the issues arise from technology. Who has the power over technology? All of a sudden, if you can control where microchips come from and the price of microchips, where they can go, you control so much because a lot of the military equipment nowadays is heavily dependent on microchips, as is anything else, technology-wise. So that's something that who's the guy? Who was foreign minister, Priest, America. Of what is did you hear yesterday? How he's going for president, and he was talking to
Mike
Pence. That's it. Sorry,
Pence,
not Priest. Yeah, did you hear that he would Tucker Carlson was kind of interviewing him, and he turns around saying, look, places in America are being devastated. We're in the worst situation. So many states have so many people under the poverty line, and you're more worried about giving funds to Ukraine for the Ukrainian war. And he's like, the Americans aren't my concern. He pretty much blatantly came out and said it. So you can see that a lot of it is all about, making sure their geopolitical foreign interests are covered worldwide. And it's for for those few at the top who have all of their, what's it called? They have their interests in the military, but we shouldn't get sidetracked by that because they also have ideological interests, which is what creates that dominance and is what is holding Islam back as well, because they're constantly attacking Islam on that basis.
Yeah, exactly. And the UN, like you guys are saying, I mean, from its history and stuff like that, even if you look at, we talk about Russia having a seat and a veto, but actually, if you think about when they were given this seat, this was America's way of bringing them kind of within the international order to a certain extent. Had they stayed out of it,
100%.
Then it's like now at China, for example, there are certain elements where it doesn't want to abide by the international situation. The norms. Yeah, it wants to do things its own way, and that's America's biggest problem. That America wants it to do things. Doesn't matter if you want to call it communist, not. It wants it to do things in line with its global vision. But another thing, really, then, when we talk about UN and stuff, that comes to mind is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, in the Quran, that do not take the Jews and Christians as Auliya, and so on. And I think that's an important lesson also that we can take from this, because here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us over 1400 years ago. But if we look at the reality, we see this happening over and over again. Look at Modi, for example. His recent trip to the US. Look how it was covered. Look how he was welcomed. Everyone knows what's happening in India. There's nothing hidden. And actually, the one of the guys, I don't know what his name is, the guy who he wrote the book about the 10 steps to genocide, famous author, and he's still alive, and he's saying, look, trust me, India is almost there, type of thing. However, because it's the geopolitical needs of America having a strong India to combat the rise of China, they don't care what's happening there. So Muslims have to understand that in reality, there are only two camps in this world. There's Islam and there's Kufr. It does not matter who the other side is. Because if you look at the situation today, whether it's the Hindutva, whether it's the Buddhists in Myanmar, whether it's the Chinese in Xinjiang, East Turkmenistan, whether it's the Yahud in Palestine, wherever it is, it seems like there's a common enemy, and that is Islam and Muslims. And we can even link this to current things. I mean, look at the rise of far right, and maybe Abdullah, you can mention some of this, like you're talking about nationalism and stuff. We see this like in Poland, for example. In Poland, the elections, when they were won, one of the main cards that they used was the anti-Islamic one, even though there's probably like 0.00 something percent of Muslims in Poland. It's just nowadays that's the thing that is being used, because there is this anti-Islamic feeling that's going around the world, whichever side it is. So it really goes to show the fact that you can't take the kuffar as awliya. And what we have to recognize as well, that when push comes to shove, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that the awliya or the kuffar are the awliya to each other. They will, when it comes to a common need, even for example the EU and the predecessor of the EU, when they came about because of Ottoman expansion. The Europeans were fighting for centuries, and they realized, you know what, if we don't stop fighting, then basically the Ottomans are going to take over. And it's just sad when probably Erdogan is playing some political trick, I'm not sure, but when you see them, Turkey, talking about joining the EU, it's clear EU is a Christian club. Its origins were there to stop the Turks. They're not going to let the Turks They're not gonna let the Turks do what they stopped, at Vienna, right? The gates of Vienna. They opened without any fighting, and they say, "Here, have access to Europe. Come and have your babies and take over the population," right? But what it shows is, certainly, we're seeing right now that whichever side it is, the common enemy seems Muslims and Islam.
Yeah.
Abdullah, what are you saying?
That's quite a bit to dissect there. In regards to this sort of the far right, the first point, there's a particular narrative that they share all common together. You mentioned the EU as well, for example, that, the purpose of it was to, of course, sort of, I guess, like hold upon their identity. And part of that identity pertains to sort of so-called anti-Muslim invasion kind of identity, that deals with that the far right like to use quite a bit. Like when it comes to the EU, that's mostly more of a, I guess you could sort of say, a liberal kind of entity. At the time, we did have, for example, OPEC, like the Arab countries that were that had this sort of kind of a trade agreements to deal with, like empowering themselves with the matter of oil. So of course the EU, it was more to counter Russia, but at the same time we could also see it as sort of this kind of like this economic counter against perhaps like OPEC, and like being heavily reliant upon the Muslim oil, And when it comes to the far right, there is that sort of rhetoric that they use against Muslim immigration, whereby they corresponded to the Ottoman invasions of Europe. And regardless of, like, look how, for example, today they have their cultures preserved, they have their religions preserved, because the Ottoman Empire did value that sort of Islamic aspect of, allowing people to practice their religion, and even giving them semi-autonomy to having their own particular courts, and having recognized church officials within the Ottoman Empire. the issue is that they will, of course, resort to this particular rhetoric in order to gain this kind of victim card. That look, now we're victim of an influx of Muslim invasions. I remember in Slovakia there was this famous politician. I forgot his name. He literally said that Islamization starts with kebab shops. You know, so like he's literally tying it just to the way that
Yeah.
the way that we our cuisine, regardless of how bland his cuisine is. The issue the issue is that they're looking for just literally anything
Yeah.
in order to victimize themselves.
You can see it from all the rhetoric in France. Basically, what you're
Yeah.
saying. Look at all the rhetoric in France and all the immigrants and all
Mhm.
everything's happening. Everything gets linked back to those cultural differences. Sorry,
Yeah.
carry on.
Yeah, and Brother Rash mentioned the issue of Westphalia, which I did want to talk about just a little bit. There is that sort of norm that like, okay, we're not going to invade one another. Of course, in terms of the West,
Yeah.
we're we're not going to fight against another because they were very bloody wars. I mean, Germany before was into I think more than 300 states before it unified. There was countless bloodshed and warfare occurring, and they said enough is enough. But of course, within the context of Europe, and they wanted to make that sort of norm of not fighting between states. And then whenever a state is interfered, then of course everybody is going to fight for that victim. So when it comes to, for example, the matters of why is there more, for example, I guess, concern about when the Nazis invaded Poland. And of course the Nazis were already sort of oppressing the Jews in turn, like even prior to the actual Holocaust. Why was that the case? Because they violated the international norm of crossing into another country. That's why, for example, in China, when we have the Uyghurs in East Turkestan that are being literally systematically just vanquished from the region. The population rate is going actually quite down. The issue is that of course China isn't using hard power to invade other countries. They're using soft power. They're using economic power in order to establish themselves, throughout the world. I believe it was just in Sri Lanka there was a port that Sri Lanka couldn't pay back a while ago. And what happened is it was a Chinese loan, and what happened is China actually just bought the whole place. And even in Pakistan, I think in Karachi, they wanted to buy these particular ports. But the issue is that when you indebt someone that they can't pay it, of course, you take ownership of that. So that's how they're sort of spreading their power. That's how we should be aware of this issue. China wants to reach all the way to Greenland as well. They want to buy ports over there because it's the spread of soft economic power that, of course, could transition to hard power. And there's this particular norm right now of when people use hard power, such as Saddam Hussein, such as Putin, such as of course Adolf Hitler. What happens is that people will antagonize immediately right away these particular figures. Not in defense of these figures at all. But they'll use that right away to antagonize and gain something from that. So of course, those people who are antagonizing them, of course, they're from the particular Western kind of context. You know, it's really important to be aware of these particular political dynamics than just see the media and just pray for peace. Of course, we do pray for the matters of peace, but we have to realize like whose peace is it? The peace, like what is the concept of peace? Is the peace just the balance of power, the status quo? The UN would agree with me if I were to say that it is the status quo, because of course everybody wants to pertain their particular position of power. They don't want to lose their power. So we have to understand, what pertains of what is the real definition of peace in terms of, the Islamic model. As Brother Majid said, we have, Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Kufr, and there's all these particular, especially in the universities I go to, there's always this, whenever this is mentioned, there's always this neo-Orientalist kind of position that they try to impose, which is that, we're actually in Dar al-Dawa, but it's not even about dawah. Let's be honest. It's just really about us being an inferior complex and being tolerant to everything. And instead of actually giving the dawah so that not only do people's hearts change, inshallah, but like literally the hukam, the rulings within these particular countries, Canada, UK, actually change towards Islam. But of course, people are going to shy away from these particular discussions. Yeah.
A couple of things. I found that really insightful, really, because I think this triggered another thought for me. I think people fall into a couple of camps based on what you were just saying there. And alhamdulillah, you're right. I think more people are becoming more aware that it's not just a case of the good guys and the bad guys. And ironically, I don't know if you guys watched the interview between Andrew Tate recently and Tucker Carlson on Twitter, isn't it? You know how obviously this is part of, since what's happened, since the so-called coup d'etat or the attempted coup in Russia, there's a lot of discussion been going on about how the platform for information and mainstream media, how it's struggling against the likes of Twitter and the likes of, news coming out on channels that are not as easy to suppress. So a lot of the footage that came out on Twitter when what was happening in Russia a few weeks ago, the mainstream media wasn't covering it, but it was being covered by kind of just almost nobodies on these Twitter spaces on Twitter. But then off the back of that, and not even off the back, it started before then. And you know how there's been a number of these kind of videos that have had hundreds of millions of views. Even that video between Tucker Carlson and Andrew Tate in the first day had like 60 million views through Twitter. And one of the things Andrew Tate said was that, people need to be more aware of the fact that these wars that are happening, because they were talking about Ukraine. They're talking about Ukraine and about a lot of people previously falling into the trap of, okay, we're the good guys, the Russians are the bad guys, and therefore this is the conflict. That's why we need to support Ukraine. And he was highlighting that, you can't just using that very simplistic way of viewing these things. So I think more and more people are starting to become aware that we can't just listen to mainstream media and just take that narrative and assume it's correct. And clearly, if that's happening in the naturally in the populations of everybody, then that's also going to affect the Muslims in a positive way. And it has. So that was one point I just wanted to quickly make. And then the other side is, there's an interesting macro and a micro way of looking at this is, how you talked about the right wing and you talked about obviously the rise of China and Russia and things. Don't you find it interesting that on the micro level, that Muslims previously gravitated towards the liberal left because it was the left that was supporting the minorities. It was the left that were giving us our mosques. It was the left that was supporting us in our kind of endeavors in a Western country when we arrived here. And now it's that same left, and it was the right who were attacking us for our color, who were racist, who were attacking us for being different. And so Muslims gravitated to the left. Then now what you have is it's the left that are pushing the liberal LGBT, gender, all of these things, and Muslims are opposing it. And suddenly it's the right that are supporting the Muslims because they're going, it's only the Muslims that are standing up against these flawed liberal ideas and teaching our children and stuff in the mosques. So then you're getting some Muslims gravitating to the right. So you're getting that at a micro level. And at a macro level, you're also getting some Muslims supporting Russia, going, you know what, wait there, look at America, they're the bad guys, so let's support Russia in these endeavors. But in both situations, micro and macro, Muslims, we need to be careful not to gravitate to either side because they're just sticking to whatever their interests are at a particular time. Whereas what we need to do is wait there a minute. Yeah, okay, there might be some things on either side of the fence that Islam complies with, but actually Islam has solutions to both of those problems, be it at the micro level or the macro level. And I think gradually it is going in that direction. Gradually people are going, wait there a minute, they were with us before, now these guys are with us, wait there's something not quite right here. I found that quite interesting in recent times.
I think that's where the political awareness comes into, Rush, because Muslims, because we don't have that political awareness, we really, and this sounds bad, but we are used as cannon fodder right now. When they want to use jihad to push a certain thing, they'll promote those people who are saying jihad. Then when they want to clamp down on people, they use the same jihad, to say that these guys are extremists and they need to be wiped out. And I think that's where, because I remember when this Ukraine stuff cracked off, and obviously Muslims are anti-American, so they automatically jumped on the Russian boat. And you're like, look, listen, it's not as simple as that, because just look at what Russia was doing in Syria not long ago. If you want to read about what the Russians did in Grozny, in Chechnya, just go and find out, right? But again, it's because they're not willing to think. They're willing to be just emotionally led. And when you're emotionally led, you will get pulled in any direction people want you to. They will treat you like a light switch. They'll turn you on when they want, then they'll turn you off when they want. And that's one of the biggest issues that we have. And like you're saying, we shouldn't really look at, like Rush, think years ago, you gave the example of a box. You're in this box and all the options that are given in this box, but actually we need to be outside of this box, because if we're restricted into A or B, and in one way or another it serves them, right? Then you ultimately, it's their interests that are being served ultimately, right? Even though in the short term it may look like it's serving yours. One example I want to give is the Uyghur stuff has been going on for a long time. Systematically, these people, their culture, everything's being wiped out, right? But when America now wants to put the spotlight on China, it will raise that issue because it knows it can get the Muslims to have a certain view of China. Then on top of that, even it could even, start funneling in some weapons and start some sort of insurgency and get, you understand, where ultimately the goal seems good because it's about the protection of the Muslim lives. However, it's serving someone else's purpose. And I think that's when, as long as Muslims, when we stop being cannon fodder, I think that's when we can take the next step. However, and this goes down to a point that I wanted to raise anyway, was, can the Ummah do this just by the Muslims themselves? In the sense, like, can this happen without any sort of leadership? Can this happen without any sort of unity? And that's the point. So what I was thinking about earlier when you guys were discussing is, you look at the UN, and why were Muslims looking to the UN? Because they were seeking security. They were seeking protection. Whose responsibility is it to protect citizens? Whether they're Muslims or non-Muslims, it's the authorities, right? However, if you look at when it comes to Muslims, in India, the authorities are not protecting them. What happened in Srebrenica, the authorities never, in Bosnia, authorities not protecting them. What happened in Burma, what's happening in Palestine. But even, let me extend this, look what's happening in Muslim lands. These same authorities that are designed to be protecting and securing the life of their citizens are the oppressors. Look what happened in Egypt. Look what happened at the masjid when, so many thousands were just killed by sniper fire, right? Which begs the question that, can we have that peace and security that the Muslims need without having that Islamic framework in place that gives you, as a Muslim, and then the non-Muslims that live within your domain, that protection that is needed? Not no UN recognized human rights charter. This is bogus. This is purely used for foreign policy. When you want to interfere in some land, just say that they are, violating the international human rights, right? What we're talking about is real protection of life, protection of property. All these things are the things that Islam provides. However, we don't have this. And I think that's something that's really important, that we do seek protection, we do seek peace. But in the current order, whether it's in the non-Muslim lands or whether it's in the Muslim lands, unfortunately, without having, as Brother Abdullah had mentioned first earlier, about the hukm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without having the hukm, without having the treatments from the Sharia to our problems, is going to be, we are exposed. we are exposed. We don't have that shield, as the hadith of the Messenger Sallallahu, that the Imam is the shield for the Ummah. We don't have that. So 28 years ago, Srebrenica happened. Bosnia happened. Now India is happening. Gujarat happened many years ago. How many more of these things are going to happen when Muslims will actually think the things that we are being channeled down, the roads that we are being channeled down, whether it's to do with, petitioning or boycotting or charities and stuff like this, the more we involve ourselves in activities which may give us some sort of short-term, I'm not even going to say solution, because solution actually solves the problem, but short-term relief, shall I say, until we don't do that, how many more Srebrenicas, Gujarats, Janin, right? How many more of these are going to happen until something actually changes? And I think that's the concern. And I think that's a lesson that you take from Srebrenica. But I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, guys. I'm not sure whether that's really hit home with Muslims en masse.
Yeah, subhanAllah. I remember back in 2014, or was it 2014, 15? I forgot. With the rise of Daesh, what happened is that I believe the militaries of Muslim-dominated countries came together in order to lead I forgot what the initiative was called, a combined militarized counter against the rise of Daesh. So I always like pose the question, like imagine if they actually did unite, they did, for example, elect the Khalifa, maybe, of course, because I do believe the Khilafah is something that's wajib, that should be, it's a necessity for the Muslims to have an imam ruling them. Imagine they did take this kind of initiative in order to deal with the things that are pertaining, as you mentioned, matters of Gujarat, like you mentioned Gujarat, you mentioned Jenin in Palestine, you mentioned in Bosnia, etc., Kashmir, etc. Where is that particular initiative being taken? And it's of course not from the status quo current regimes that we have. The current regimes are of course interested in their own selves. The whole kind of idea, for example, of Khilafah is actually quite even threatening for Muslim states, because there is that sort of Westphalian norm of not having a sort of expansive state. Like everybody's used to these sort of borders, and once you say that no, we don't believe in borders, we believe in frontiers, we believe in expansion. Of course, that is like everybody's going to get scared about that. Like the US right away is going to, the US, the UK, Russia, China, etc. They're going to be all concerned about that, because no one will ever sort of use this particular terminology, which is quite, for thousands of years, has been quite normative, up till literally Westphalia in 1648, I believe. And, subhanAllah, it's just in terms of the Ummah solution. Of course, this is like the very generic sort of based means, to have a Khilafah. In terms of how to achieve it, that's a whole other sort of discussion in terms of methodology and whatnot. But we do recognize that we need that sort of not sort of this direct Imam upon the Quran and the Sunnah to basically be that shield, as Rasul Sallam said. The Imam is the shield of the Ummah, and regardless of what origins. I remember I was reading, I think yesterday a bit, and I already knew this. During the time of the Ottoman Sultan / Khalifa, when he was getting distress calls from Al-Andalus, he actually sent dispatches of boats to Al-Andalus to save the Muslims, as well as Jews as well too, in that particular region. So that begs the question, we like regardless of whether or not we could, of course, during that time the Ottomans could reclaim Al-Andalus or not. The issue is that he still had this fikr, this concern, and unfortunately today, many Muslim, so-called leaders, so-called rulers, do not have that fikr, that concern being a shield for the Ummah. It's something that, Umar ibn Khattab, he was someone who, he was concerned about a donkey in Iraq being misused, subhanAllah. So what kind of, where can we, when will we get these sort of leaders? We should always, have this kind of fikr and this concern and speak about these issues.
Mm. I've never looked at it. I never thought of it that way. Whenever I talk about or read about Westphalia, I'm just thinking of the Western countries. But actually, that's a very relevant point, because it's that same, even if there was two Muslim countries trying to fight for one to expand its borders into another, the West would rise and prevent that, because the West would prefer that the Muslims stay dissected. In fact, they further dissect them, like, the likes of Sudan and places like that we're seeing recently. So that's a really relevant point. It's not just a case of preventing, like, European nations coming together and creating like an opposing state against the US. It's actually those nation states that the West created in the Muslim lands never taking over one another either. So that's really relevant, really relevant. Imagine, in regards to your question, no doubt, I think the actual end goal can only be achieved by Islamic unity, by an imam, a proper leadership. However, I know it's for another day, but I think the main thing is for us to ensure that's not just like a utopian, just let's wait for that to happen. I think individuals need to start to go, if I want to get there, how do I get there, and what is my role in that activity? And we have the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're not ever asked to do anything that we don't have a methodology for doing. Every single one of our obligations has a methodology. So this is, people's blood is being spilt across the globe, and we're talking about Srebrenica. This many Muslims, blood was spilt. So much blood was spilled. So many of our sisters were violated. And are we saying that Islam doesn't have a solution to preventing this? To say that would be to go against the clear-cut verses of the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He has perfected this deen. To say that there isn't a solution is to go against Allah's word. There is a solution, and there's therefore, for a solution, there has to be a methodology. And therefore, we need to look at that methodology. And no doubt, if we tread on that path, then we have Allah on our sides at the end of the day, and we will be successful. And it has been prophesied, we will be successful. But the question is how much are we willing to contribute to that activity?
Yeah. No, exactly, bro. I think, like you said, maybe it is one for a future episode, because it's a big topic in itself. But I think what I'll just add to that is certainly what's the way it's everything's being set right now is you can try A, you can try B, you can try C, you can try D. However, if you talk about the Islamic solution, it's unrealistic and it's like dismissed. And I'm talking about, this is talking within Muslims. You can have 5 Muslims sitting in a room. One person will mention this, one person, and the fifth guy might mention, actually, we need political unity, we need X, Y, and Z. And that will be the one which is seen as, utopia, or seen as something which is not being realistic. But actually, that is being realistic. But what people have to understand is, it's not going to happen overnight. However, if you don't know in which direction your journey is in, then how can you make that journey? If you don't understand what it needs to go on this journey to actually reach a destination, what it takes in terms of planning and how much food to take with you and all sorts of things, then you're always going to be going down blind alleys, going down dark tunnels. You're never going to.
Yeah.
Right? And it may well be that the way it's shown is that actually, this dark tunnel is more realistic. Look at that journey. Look how difficult it is. I mean, subhanAllah, just thought came into my mind was, look at the Battle of Tabuk. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set the Battle of Tabuk, you look at the sort of time it was like I think there may have been a bit of a drought. It was like in Ramadan, or it was really hot, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gave this instruction, and the Prophet said, we're going to Tabuk. And a lot of this was to test the Muslims. And remember, there were some people who failed that test. There was the munafiq who exposed themselves, but there were Muslims, good Muslims, Sahabi, who erred in this, and later on they were forgiven. However, it was a kind of a test that we're going to go on this journey. And it just seems like when you speak to people about unity, Khilafah, all these things, or what can we do, or let's forget what can we do, let's start even thinking about what can we do. It just seems like it's just that far distant journey that I can't be dealing with that. I'll entertain everything else except this. And I think that mindset, is maybe still problematic. And I think that's something which one of the lessons that we were talking about from Srebrenica, I think, as long as we continue working for anything other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to and commands us to, we will not receive any justice, we will not receive any honor, any izzah, and in fact, the situation will become worse. As it is, a few days ago, there was a video of, a family being kicked out of the house in Palestine and some settlers moving in. Do you think this would have happened here? Do you think this would have happened at the worst time when there was Islamic political unity? This stuff never happened. So, no one is saying that during the Khilafah it was utopia. But you look at the situation of the Ummah in how it's been dealt with before, when there was political unity and some sort of authority, and after, the difference is just so blatant. Right now, we are completely exposed, right? But brothers, like everything good in life, the podcast does have to come to an end. There are so many things that we could discuss. I mean, to be honest with you, I didn't even think that Brother Abdullah had got going, because I know there were certain things that he wanted to unpack during this podcast. But I think for now, I think this was quite sufficient in regards to the topic. We spoke about what happened in Bosnia Srebrenica for people to go out and do a bit more research, but also some of the lessons that I think some lessons we have learned, but I think there are still lessons to be learned 28 years on. Guys, as usual, I kind of like bring the podcast to a close with your final thoughts. So Abdullah, brother, I'll start off with you. Any final thoughts that you want to add to any message to the listeners, to the viewers?
Yes, part of our iman is not just the individual assessment, but it's the societal assessment, which is understanding that Islam is not a religion of selfishness that we keep to ourselves. It's for everybody, regardless of race or background, etc. And we should not be shy in terms of discussing these aspects, regardless of the superior complex of liberalism, secularism, the superior complex of the UN, or perhaps in the more eastern side, the Communist Party of China, or in Russia, you have, of course, that particular superior complex of Putin's regime. We should not be shy in regards to understanding that, look, Islam is the most best and perfect objective way of life in all aspects. And in order to understand any sort of conflict, it always comes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's, of course, that it is a matter of test and tribulations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, sets us upon, so that we could seek His approval and seek His means of obtaining Jannah one day. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us that. I mean, but nevertheless, being apolitical, I'm not saying to be necessarily involved in the democratic elections and whatnot, but being apolitical, not being politically aware, is a problem, and it could be a matter of problem of one's iman. If you do not care about the sisters being violated in the Chinese communist concentration camps in East Turkestan, that is a huge problematic issue with one's own individual assessment. they are not mutually inclusive. The individual assessment of Iman, and of course the societal aspect of it, they're both mutually inclusive. So we definitely do have to have this awareness. And also, look, like subhanAllah, I'm doing my degree in political science, public policy. But the issue is that you don't need to be someone who is academically inclined in order to understand these aspects. You don't have to be involved. Of course, it's very easy. We're humans. We're able to do research. We're able to understand what is good, what is a good source, what is bad. It's something that literally even a 12-year-old can understand. Okay, this is a genocide that occurred against the Muslims. This is bad. This is something that it's not a huge sort of topic that's complicated. Rather, it's something that we have to learn to dissect and have this just out of our fikr for one another.
MashaAllah. No, that's really good points, bro. Really good points. Arash, anything you want to add, bro?
Yeah, I'm just going to add on to what Abdullah had said there in terms of, we have to take a positive view as well. Yes, there are challenging times, but the issue sometimes is where we can be quite fatalistic because we're thinking, oh, these great superpowers, oh, they have the UN and they have the US and, they're Britain and et cetera, et cetera. So we can become fatalistic. And, even when someone in that group of five you mentioned, someone says, oh, yeah, we need Islamic unity, we can be equally fatalistic and go, well, that's impossible. Yeah. However, take a step back, look at what's happening in the world today. So as Abdullah had saying is about, that political awareness. If you're politically astute, what you will see in the world today is you'll see an America that is in a few years going to be nearly 50 trillion in debt. If you look around, you're going to see a France which is burning apart from the inside. You're seeing a UK which used to be the jewel in the crown of the colonial empire is falling apart, and we are seeing it in front of our very eyes. Yeah, we look at America and a lot of the problems they're having societally. You're seeing the liberal onslaught that is destroying their family structure, destroying children, destroying everything, yeah? Why do you think the likes of these, characters like Andrew Tate and stuff are become famous? Is because of this liberal onslaught. So if you take a step back and you look at the so-called superpowers that are dominating the world sphere against Muslims today, you will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his infinite wisdom and his plan is decimating them. They've only been in power for less than 100 years. Why are we so afraid? Islam, the state that the Prophet ﷺ built in Medina lasted centuries. Why are we so afraid? We should be confident. They're falling apart in less than 100 years. And inshallah, that will be the path that we need to tread on top of to bring Islam back. So that person who in that five who comes across as unrealistic, they're not unrealistic at all. That is the person with the vision, and that is the person the Muslims need to get behind and say, brother, what do we need to do? Because while they fall apart, inshallah, over their, what do they call it, over their ashes, Islam inshallah will rise.
Ameen. Ameen. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they plot and they plan. But Allah is the best of planners. And in fact, from what you said there, it reminds me of the time when Islam burst on the scene. When Islam burst on the scene, you saw a weakening Persian Empire and the Byzantiums as well. And the time was right. And obviously, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is the one who dictates the qadr and the time of places. In the same way, Pharaoh and his army was decimated in the sea, and this was the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you're right, there should be positivity there. However, what we have to also understand is whatever happens, whether it's in our lifetime or not, on the day of judgment, it's our actions and our amal that will hold us in good stead. So, and they are linked to actions. So what it really boils down to is, what are the actions that we do in this life? What is the intention behind those actions? And inshallah, the victory has been promised. However, we have to ask, are we worthy of that victory. As Brother Abdullah has said, if we have no fikr in our hearts of what's happening, you think Allah is going to give us victory that cheap? It just doesn't work that way. But brothers, Jazakallah khair, really it's been a fantastic episode. Really benefited from everything you guys have said. I'm sure the people listening will also, and watching will also benefit from this episode. And hopefully we can do this again soon, definitely. And one thing, Abdullah, you might have noticed at the beginning, I introduced you as a co-host because you are no longer a guest. Hopefully, we will be seeing you more often on this podcast. Our pleasure to have you on. But yeah, on that note, guys, inshallah ta'ala, as always, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and inshallah ta'ala, see you on the next one.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.